Hi, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 839th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, the Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Luc Tuymans and Jason Rosenfeld. We're thrilled to welcome poet Lewis Freedman here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Luc Tuymans lives and works in Antwerp. One of the first artists to be represented by David Zwirner, Tuymans has had 17 exhibitions with the gallery since joining its roster in 1994. In 2001, the artist represented Belgium at the Venice Biennale to great acclaim. Tuymans has been featured in numerous solo exhibitions at prestigious institutions worldwide, and his works are featured in museum collections around the world as well. He's received numerous awards and honors, including the Medal of Honor, among others. And our host today, Distinguished Chair and Professor of Art History at Marymount Manhattan College, Dr. Jason Rosenfeld, has curated the exhibitions John Everett Millay, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, and River Crossings. He is a co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor-at-large for us at the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jason.
Thank you so much, Chloe. Welcome, everyone, on this kind of gloomy Friday here in New York. I hope it's a little brighter where you are. Very excited for today's NSE, number 839. Remarkable, I think. To put that into sports perspective, as if you'll forgive me, Luke, I like to do. The all-time leading scorer in all competitions in soccer is Cristiano Ronaldo. 838. We passed him. It's done. No one's ever going to have more goals than we have NSEs. Lionel Messi, by the way, has 807. And Lukaku, Belgian superstar for Luc, has 355. He's not going to make it. So 839 consecutive Zooms that we've done since the onset of COVID and in the new social environment. And it's been my pleasure to host each and every one that I have done. I want to thank Chloe, Fong, and Eleanor from the Rail. I want to thank Erin Pinover and the great Angela Chun for their help from the perspective of the gallery. We're celebrating Luc's 17th exhibition with David Zwirner and his great team. I want to thank Luc, of course, and his team at the studio, and Sarah Chan, and Lewis Freedman, poet for today, who we're looking forward to hearing from. So welcome, Luc.
Hi, how are you doing?
Very well. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Okay.
So it's happy hour in Europe, I know, but we'll see if we can get through this, and then your weekend can begin and start. So let me start the share screen. I want to thank everyone for coming out. Lots of friends in the audience. That's awesome. Should be able to see this. There we are. I encourage you to check out Luc's Instagram and the Rail, of course. So today we'll be talking about Luc's show at Zwirner on West 20th Street. It's called The Barn, and it's up through the end of July 21st. A nice long run for those of you who haven't gotten there yet. You should make your way to see these three extraordinary rooms. This is just the launch page from the website. And here, just to set it up for you, as we're going to walk through the exhibition. The first gallery, two views of it here. You come in this door, and then you see on one end this picture, and the other end to your left here, this painting, the barn, and then there are a couple other works on the wall. So that's the first gallery as you enter on 20th Street. And then the second gallery here, looking back to the first gallery, with a couple of paintings on this wall. And here in the corner, these two works, People for Scale. I didn't get them to sign their signatures, so I hope they're not annoyed that they're in there. And then the final gallery, there's 3 rooms, is this display of 4 works that form a single piece with a nice bench, so you can sit and soak it up. Thanks for that. The bench is key. Do you like the benches in your exhibitions?
Well, this was actually on purpose, this bench, because it's
Yeah.
also a particular work. So
It's related. So we'll talk about that as we work through. Luc has said that this show is part of a kind of trilogy of exhibitions that he's been showing with David Zwirner, starting with a show in Hong Kong titled Good Luck, which was, as you see here, from late 2020, i.e. in the first year of COVID. So we thought we would start with Luc just kind of very briefly talking about the 2 exhibits that led to or that presaged this particular show.
yeah, well, it was also another show which you don't have any images for, which was made in Belgium, which was called Seconds, which was particularly about the COVID situation. Which was
That's the one in Antwerp.
Yeah, which is, I mean, sort of belongs to the group in the sense because it triggered, especially the graph paintings and so on. But anyway, so this show was actually the first show for Hong Kong. And it was a show, well, this image you're looking at is actually an image that comes out of a film. I mean, it's like Mulholland Drive, where you have the one cowboy that sort of like makes a reminiscence to Tom Mix, who was the sort of like polished cowboy, and is used as the devil in the film of David Lynch. Mm-hmm. But the other works that were important and the ones that actually triggered the show were 3 works which were actually based upon Delft porcelain. And it was a show about trade and exchange in terms of a trade. And it was also an idea of like breaking into new territory in a sense. Mm-hmm. And it was also the first show after my Palazzo Grassi show, so I wanted to make a show that was kind of diverse. And actually the 3 shows have that, I mean, except from the one with the numbers, of which you may not or may have images or not. But to make a show that in a sort of way complicates itself and makes its meaning as you sort of go along, and in a strain of thought, actually like a never-ending story in a way. Mm-hmm. To the other show, Eternity, was a show which was a show that was made right after the show, as I said, with the Seconds. And I thought that after every pandemic, there is actually a negative outcome. If you think about the plague, for example. So I thought it was going to become war, which it actually became, in a sense. I mean, at least in this part of the world. And so the idea after the pandemic was actually the idea of polarization. And we're going to talk about it because David and I kept the 4 works which make out the polarization to re-show them actually in this show in New York, because I thought it was important. They were made for the show in Paris, but actually they make more sense actually in New York. So they're re-shown. That's why the bench is there too. But we can talk about that in length when we get there.
Those are the paintings that we showed in the 3rd room of the present show. And they're in this.
The show was called Eternity. Now the painting you see right in front of you is a painting which is based upon a maquette, like a glass ball, which was much more small and was also damaged because it fell. And it was the maquette that was made by Heisenberg in 1937 when the Germans were actually trying to develop the H-bomb. So this is the moment when the H-bomb sort of explodes, or it's a sort of illustration of it. And I made it very, very big. So in a sense, you can also see the shine in the concrete floor, which I thought was also in my studio, which was really important, so that you are engulfed basically by something that looks beautiful, but in a sense is quite horrific when you come to the meaning of the image itself. There's also a reminiscence to this idea of Rothko, because I was always fascinated by Rothko, by this engulfment into the color. Then there's another painting of myself, which is kind of the only funny painting, which is which you probably cannot see very well, but it's a person who is actually floating in the sea, kind of like completely lost in a sense. It's also a painting about growing old and a painting about anger management. So there's not the other painting you see in the see-through was something that of course refers directly to social distancing, although it had nothing to do with it because this was a photograph I took years before COVID from a balcony in a hospital in a waiting room.
Huh. Okay. So then we come to the present show at Zwirner, and these two works which kind of face off against each other in the initial room, the first room. The barn at left, which gives the overall exhibition its title, 2022, and at right, Creature from 2023.
Yeah, well, the barn is actually not a barn. It's probably a covered bridge somewhere at the outskirts of New York.
Yeah, I have that. I thought about that, right? The title is
so that's what it actually is. But I called it the barn because it looks like something where things are gathered. I mean, like a multitude, a plenitude of things. And at the same time, there's an element of dissolution. And I was
Are there covered bridges in Belgium? Have you ever found?
No. This is really an American
thing, right?
Right, and it also comes from it's something I saw on a website. It's actually a thing that's painted on velvet.
Right.
But it also gave me the idea of something that was sewn together like a quilt or something like that. Yeah. Very graphic. And underneath you see the sort of like, on the bottom you see actually all the images from my iPhone, so you can see that this image is actually taken with an iPhone and actually then reworked. There are also images that actually we're going to be painted, like there is the ape image already. There's several other images that are eventually going to be painted later. So, but this was the very first starting point of the image. And as I said, on the one hand, there is the element of plenitude, the element of the horn of plenitude, and at the same time something quite sinister. I mean, especially of course the entrance of the situation, which is kind of black and sucking you up. And then the graphic element, which goes back to a sort of like noticeable element of a sort of popular understanding of what an idyllic image could be and what it could not be, in a sense. So, and of course, there is the element of the social media, in which is playing a humongous role in our lives, and therefore also, again, the scroll underneath. So there is this idea of two forms of information. One that is actually, in a sense, you could say, translated in a point that is sort of dated itself, the other one that is actually still ongoing.
Are all the images at the bottom works that you have done or are in progress?
Not all of them, but some of them. Some of them, like I said, the ape thing, there's maybe another one, like the creature must be there somewhere too. The one, yeah, that's just like a black line here. There's the one that's opposite of the bar.
Yeah. So it's interesting. It's almost like a studio picture. I don't remember seeing a work in your Oeuvre where you've sort of included other works in this sort of multitude.
No, that was actually the kick to do that, in a sense, because that it warps the image, it puts it out of it.
Yeah.
And it gives it a different connotation, in a sense, and also gives it a different origin. And that's, I think, is also quite interesting.
Yeah. And it's also a little askew, which is, it looks strange, but it's a little off line. You said this is the first one that you did for the show?
Yeah, that was the first image that I did. I mean, before I start making a show, most of the imagery is actually formulated. Because when I start to work, I don't want to think anymore. I don't want to think on the canvas. I mean, that's the point where actually the intelligence from my head goes to my hands, which is and it's quite a nervous preoccupation of making that, and then it has to come out with a certain intensity. So, but this was the very first one I had. I think ape was the second. The creature, which is opposite, came much later.
And please tell people, because I don't know that everyone knows, but all of these works are done in a single day.
Yeah, the paintings are done in a single day. It can be a long day, but it's in a single day. That doesn't mean that I don't come back at it, but the minute I close the door of my studio, I know if it worked or if it didn't work. I mean, that's the important thing. And details that could be added later are mostly quite, well, they're not the decisive ones. I mean, they're kind of adjustments that can be made later, but the whole thing has to work and has to be formulated when I leave my studio.
So the additions are just for the effect, the kind of overall effect.
No, there are things in painting that you don't see with the naked eye, which are really important. So,
Yeah.
so they can be very, very decisive and very important, and you maybe only see them and perceive them yourself when you look a little bit more at the painting.
Do you project images onto the canvases or the linen to transfer these from the source material, or do you eye it?
I do both ways in a sense. I mean, the projection is also to make the size, and sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't.
Okay, because this one is quite big, right? This is pretty large, this picture. Yeah, I love the sort of symbolist soup in the foreground. It reminds me of sort of Gauguin paintings in the South Pacific, of these sort of moving bodies of water. And this, I call it a kind of symbolist soup there. And then this barn, which always has a malevolent feeling. I feel these barns, you have a little trepidation when you're approaching it by foot or by car to go into these things, which feel quite rickety, but also, are kind of dark, not well lit. This is just one in New Hampshire by artist Alex Konevsky. I went to visit up there, and there's a barn. But I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. We have tons of barns. That's like the biggest tourist draw in that. Sorry, not barns. Bridges, these covered bridges. We have tons of these sort of covered bridges, but clearly it's the same technique they're using to build them. So the other picture that is, here's just a detail of the lower section with all these small little vignettes. The other painting that faces it in the first gallery is this one, Creature.
Yeah, it's a painting that I had really to adjust to. I mean, to appease myself to it, because in a sense it was the more difficult of all the paintings, and because it's a strange painting. But I needed something that sort of like would warp the situation, and this is actually the image that's been. It's a Ukrainian soldier which been thwarted or just changed or altered by means of a computer stirred image. So it's actually a sort of modified image, an image that is actually distorted in itself. And I found it interesting because it sort of like gave a sort of totem-like element, like something you perceive immediately and also perceive immediately as something that is threatening. And therefore it's also opposite of the barn in the show, because the barn is the States and this is actually Europe in a sense. So that's also what the show is actually doing. It brings those two elements actually together in a sort of painted time, if you'd like.
The two regions, US and Europe. Is this a figure sort of holding something to its face?
Well, the figure is holding, actually holding a gun. I mean, there's something next to it, but here it's like detached from the body. In a sense.
Yeah, and then it has these extraordinary sort of striations coming out of it in like a burst pattern, which reminds me of this sort of idea that you're saying that it's warped through the computer to make this sort of image. The surface actually looks warped. It isn't. It's flat, but it looks warped.
No, that was also interesting that if you look at it, it's like the canvas is not really stretched, or there is a sort of wobbly side to it, but that's actually purely the painterly effect of it. So it gives a space in a space in a sense. I mean, I also don't work on stretched canvas. I work on canvas that is just nailed on the wall.
Yeah,
which gives me the time to till the very last moment to still differ, even if it's just a couple of millimeters, to actually adjust the image or the format.
Mm-hmm.
I think everything has to, yeah.
And then when you stretch it, do you ever do more work on it?
Well, if sometimes, most of the time not. I mean, what is also interesting is that when the painting is unstretched, the visibility is higher than when it's stretched. It's very strange. When it's stretched, it becomes an object. It's like a skin that grows over it. An additional skin. It's very strange. It's always the same element. And it's also an element of like finishing off the image in a sense and creating a different type of distance. I mean, distance is quite important in my work.
What do you mean by visibility is stronger when it's
Well, that you see more details when it's actually not stretched in a sense. It's a very weird thing, but for me it always is this strange thing, and also this strange kick that when we stretch them, how will they actually come out?
Huh. It's sort of like an old master painting that's unlined and has more of a kind of surface action. And when you line it,
It's the intimacy. I
Yeah.
mean, the intimacy with the medium itself that is then actually sort of like given up in a sense.
Yeah.
Turned into an object.
Right. Huh. Okay, so Ukrainian soldiers. So there are other references to the present war in this exhibition, but it's quite a direct and facing the barn. Well,
the other one which you see on the side is actually a paint. It's a painting actually. I had a visit in the Louvre because I have to do something in the Louvre, and I visited it when there were no people in it, when it was closed. But also the lights were not on, so the paintings were not lit, but there was sunlight coming in. And on one of the surface, the painting surface, the sunlight fell, and it functioned like nearly a mirror reflecting the light back. And I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of like a non-image in a sense, where only the frame sort of like encapsulates the idea of what an image could be. So it's like a purely atmospheric image, and at the same time it has this element of a monumental point in it.
Mm-hmm. I don't think I think you probably agree that whatever the actual painting is unimportant. But the question that I had is, was it glazed? Are we looking at a glazed picture where the light is coming off of it, or is it?
So the painting was highly varnished, so therefore you can get the sort of shimmering the light on it. Yeah.
And then it just kind of occludes the actual image or anything you might actually perceive in it.
Yeah, exactly. So as a spectator, you can perceive whatever you want in it, and so in a sense, but mostly it's a painting of light, of course.
That's interesting. Were the lights were off when you were there? The artificial lighting?
Yeah, the artificial lighting was off, so you just have the natural light coming in, which is kind of interesting if you look at the painting of the Louvre like that, because it turns them into something completely different.
And of course, that's how mostly they were perceived initially when they were first made, many of them. I done some work with Cecily Brown, and her father, David Sylvester, the great critic and art historian, he used to go to her exhibitions and insist that they turn the lights out so that he could see it just with daylight, just with natural light, and without any artificial light, to kind of understand the paintings in a deeper way. Galleries don't do that anymore. You have to have the lights on, and you have to have white walls. But I love this idea of this kind of just deconstructed image, which is just about a kind of reflected light. And this painting, as we just saw, is on the entry wall. So you actually come in, and it's not the one you see first, but it is the one you see last when you leave. And it feels like it has quite a poetic element as you leave the show, maybe more aesthetic than the other works.
Maybe, and on the other hand, it's probably also more ironic because it's about nothingness in a sense. So
yeah,
in that sense, it's actually quite cruel.
To obliterate the source.
Yeah, but no. Also, it emphasized again that the painting is a commodity, of course.
Right.
So that's an interesting point.
Right. Okay. And what about? And here's the other picture which hangs next to it. With this amazing, it's a halo. It's like a halo, headless.
Yeah, it's an old fascination with me and uniforms, probably.
Right.
And so what actually you see is a bellboy, but it's cropped in a way that it sort of like, of course, gives a reminiscence to much more a soldier or an officer or something in that line. And this is quite an old fascination. There's also like a very old work that I made like a gouache that I made in 1978 or something, where also of a naval officer on the beach who's picking something up, where the white of the cap is also nearly abstracted as this one. Mm-hmm. And it's an image that is sort of deals with this idea of completely stylizing this figure into a sort of non-being, a sort of appearance, non-appearance, and nearly giving this element of abstraction to just highlight the elements that could configure a person or not configure a person. And on the other hand, it's sort of like an anonymous image and an image about the idea what an uniform does. It anonymizes people, but it also creates a certain stance to it in terms of what power is.
Mm-hmm. And the elements that are the most important elements in a portrait, the head, the face, the hands, all of that are gone. Yeah, you're left with this sort of almost like the H.G. Wells' Invisible Man with just the clothing on.
Yeah, and it's turned with the back to you, so you approach it from the back, which turning the back to somebody is also quite offensive. And at the same time, it's an element of defense also. So, but this rigid form was kind of important for me because it sort of played into this idea of the times we're living also, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And the leitmotif of the uniform and the soldier is something that certainly does, as you say, run through your work. You see it consistently. This is what, do you want to say anything about the source material for this image?
Well, the source material comes out of a YouTube film of 1936 in Dresden of a bellboy in front of a hotel. So,
a colorized film or some
colorized film, yeah.
Rare early film. That fascinating, the kind of things that just kind of hit on your consciousness and then turn into a painting. And across the way from these two is this picture, Smiley.
Yeah, which is probably, this is what my wife and I saw during COVID, basically, this balloon that came several times a month floating in front of your window. This was kind of ironic in a sense.
Just randomly in Antwerp?
Yeah, randomly, yeah. So and you also see the swipes, because this is also from my iPhone, an image that I took. You see the swipes of the sweat on the side.
It's from your fingers, the acid.
My fingers.
From your fingers. Why are there Smiley balloons randomly floating around?
I have no idea. But I mean, but of course this is meant quite ironically in a sense that the Smiley becomes again yet in a certain sense a danger in a sense, so it becomes a bit more morbid. Yeah. And anyway, I don't know if you ever saw the guy who created Smiley at the end of his life, and because he was a manic depressed person. But this thing was kind of fascinating because I first painted the whole structure around it, the air, the atmosphere, and at the very latest I painted the object, which was very problematic because it could easily go wrong. Right. But by adding the orange and the red, I was able to model it in a sense that it really came out of the painting. That's why I like the painting so much.
I have a question about the white in paintings like this. I was talking to an artist at Ridley Howard, who's been on with me previously last night, and he said, can you ask him about the kind of white that you use in your pictures? I know you sort of avoid black, but what is the nature, what kind of white paint do you typically employ in these pictures?
The white paint?
Yeah.
It's Titan white.
Titan white.
Titanium, yeah.
And then do you blend it with other pigments or tones?
I just mix the colors when I'm going at it. I mean, I just don't pre-mix things. I just mix it on the palette, which is also a piece of canvas just on the table. And then next to because the canvas is bigger than what the painting is, I can then make a trial next to the image. Because there's a big difference between what you have on a sort of horizontal surface and a vertical surface. Yeah.
So everything is painted on the vertical surface, but you're using a canvas as a palette instead of smooth wood or a metal palette.
No, and just the same material that already sort of makes the link in a sense, yeah.
Huh, interesting. The balloon is also something I've seen in your work previously. Here's one from a few years ago, and you talk about the Smiley balloon as being kind of creepy, and the smiley face itself, any of you are in the audience are familiar with Alan Moore's Watchmen, the comic series, the Smiley motif is something which portends malevolence and death. And then the image here on the right of this this clown, always kind of creepy, with balloons. And then I know you've talked in other interviews, especially an interview with our own Jared Ernest in 2016 for the Rail about Fritz Lang's M, the film from 1931, where the balloon is the kind of symbol of preciousness and precariousness and perishability. in that film. So something about balloons in these works and something about COVID.
Yeah, the balloons are something like, there's like an ephemerical element to it, in the sense that they, of course, are very fragile and they have a certain body. So they have a sort of sculptural presence. And at the same time, as I said, they have an immense vulnerability. And because this specific image is actually an image that comes from the killer clowns. There was this wave in the States with killer clowns. And so
Right.
this is the guy that was going around with a baseball bat and these balloons at the same time.
Yeah.
And
Stephen
of course,
King.
yeah, but of course, clowns are kind of difficult because they turn into a cliche very easily. But connecting it with the balloons, which were not there, makes it a difference. And there's also nearly a Mickey Mouse sort of cartoony shadow that it actually delivers on the side.
Yeah, that's right. I think also the Smiley balloon, there's the potential for escape. We're all locked down in COVID, and here's this balloon that's sort of freely, like the red balloon in that old film, flying into the sky.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's a different form of incarceration, because you imagine you would be in that balloon in this vast space around you. So that could also be threatening.
And no control. One last work in the first room.
This of course has to do with the States. This is actually Animatron from Disney. Disney made this whole thing about this Animatron of Lincoln, who actually also speaks in a sense. And he actually made a whole thing with a lot of presidents. I think even Trump is in there now, I suppose. But I was amazed by, this was the very first one and the most important one for him. And so I really zoomed in upon this imagery till this imagery sort of like nearly dissolved itself and became a skeleton of itself. I mean, it became something between a dead skull or a dog or something like that. And of course, that's a reminiscence about the idea where we're at now too, in a sense, with the idea of democracy being endangered and all those elements. And so that's why this image is there. And in the show, it's next to the balloon, so which is kind of
it's right next to the balloons. Have a kind of
to the other.
Yeah, they have a kind of superficial jokiness, but they're not. They're quite serious, and they feel malevolent the closer you get to them. It reminded me of work in your show from David's gallery in 2005, the show called Proper. This image, and this is a picture I shot of the show many moons ago. The one there in the corner with wonderfully this empty wall next to it. Of course, it's an image of Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, which is now in the collection MoMA, and that idea of the eyes and politics and all these kinds of things. Would you say that there has been a kind of new formal strategy that you've developed in the last, I don't know, 16, 18 years between these two works?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one of Condoleezza Rice was probably a more different statement than the one with Abe Lincoln, which goes into the element of dissolving itself, whereas the painting of Condoleezza Rice is about reinstating the image in a sense. He was also the Secretary of State when this was painted. And but there is a link, because the link goes from there to there. If you'd like to, you could make an historical link from that to that and the other way around. Also interesting to know that, of course, she was part of the Republican Party, which was the party that actually absolved slavery.
The party of Lincoln. They always.
So in that sense, you could make a direct link if you'd like. But when I painted this painting, I was actually really sort of intrigued by Condoleezza Rice as a person, in terms that we never knew. I mean, and still don't know what she would add up to, in a sense.
Yeah.
And it was also a show that I made in 2005 after 9/11, and my wife and I were in the United States during 9/11, which was horrific. And so after that, most of the situation became like really paranoid in a sense. Society became also extremely regressive. And my first idea was to do something about, at that point, ballroom dancing became really important again. So I was thinking about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and by accident I found an image of the governor's ball of that year, which was 2005, over the seal with it. This was the skull of the Texas governor's ball.
Yeah.
And the same week, when I painted that painting, one of my best friends at that point was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who actually then made a comment about Condoleezza Rice when she came to Belgium, that she was not unpretty and intelligent. And I thought that's interesting. So to go for the aberration within the George Bush legislation, and also that's what intrigued me. That's what made me interested in this image, which was a very topical image. I mean, this was very difficult when people saw it for the first time. And overnight, I think Glenn Laurie also phoned David and said that the painting should belong to a museum collection because otherwise it could be misunderstood, which was a very smart move, I think.
Yeah. And of course, it's been lent, and you've shown it again, right? In some of your other, multiple times. Yeah, it's a powerful picture. And the thing that I gravitate to is both the determination in the eyes and then the teeth. You just don't always see teeth in paintings. Such a sign of
that was a real feature of the person, sort of like the decisiveness of it, and not in a sense. So I say it remains an enigmatic image in a sense.
There's
and also
literalness of it, the literalness of it versus the way that you've made the Lincoln head kind of diaphanous in a way.
Yeah, this is probably this is the time in between those images. Although, as I say, they have a link. Yeah.
So the view into the second gallery gives you this vista of this great painting, looking at Bob from 2022.
Yeah, the joy of painting. I mean, this is meant. Ironically, of course, in a sense. But it's also something that was even, and still is to a point, popular even in Europe. I mean, this personality who is actually a sort of mediatized personality within the idea of what art of something of branding, for example, could be, because it's also about branding. He was not able to change his hairdo because of the branding, in a sense.
Right. He hated it, but he couldn't.
And there was this sort of empathy that came out of the figure itself, his voice, that was very attractive to a lot of women because it had this sort of like smoothness, and in a sense like was sort of, and he actually saved a lot of people from suicide by making them paint. So in a sense he had this sort of social function, which was interesting. And then it was also the first time, he was not the first time, the first person who did these things on television, but he was probably the one that sort of like emanated the most empathy and therefore was also the most liked in a sense. And I like that idea because it also is a reminiscence to the projection of the painter at his easel, but then at the same time, the mediatized figure with it. So, and it is of course a joke on the idea of branding. So this is kind of important.
Yeah, I put a few things up here to kind of think about in looking at this picture. I think your choices in the painting are fascinating. I had no interest in kind of finding the exact source, and I'm sure you've manipulated it anyway, but it's a kind of atypical image of him in a way, because if you look at any of the still images of him, he's always like there in the upper left, smiling, he's radiating a kind of buoyancy, the joy of painting right there. And with the finished picture at his easel, and I was thinking about the ways that artists sort of self-represent themselves, like Artemisia Gentileschi on the left. She's painting, but you're not allowed to see what she's painting, right? And Judith Leyster, she's painting, but it's pretty much finished, right? So it's these kind of posed images, which is sort of retained in the way that he is usually shown. But in your work, it's doing something different. It's sort of showing him actually at work, laboring behind this sickle, this sort of form, which looks like a sickle, and then the canvas, which is clearly unfinished.
Yeah, and I also like the idea of this becomes nearly an abstract painting in a sense. And if you look at the jeans, there's this blue line, which is very important, which is kind of nice, which on the one hand flattens it, but at the same time extrapolates the image. Also the intersection with this thing, this static that is going straight to the figure,
Yeah.
And of course, the fascination with the hair, which is basically important. I mean, this is like a sort of form on its own, in its own, I mean, right, so to speak. So in that sense, it makes a sort of distance between what is shown and what is being seen, in a sense. And I think that's quite interesting. That's what intrigued me, actually.
Yeah. And the hair is almost like a helmet or a
Yeah,
or
it's something that is there to stay. Yeah, it's like a solid form in a sense.
yeah,
But
another halo.
it gives light. It brights up. And also, what's important with this show is that, unlike, well, maybe not already in the show in Hong Kong, but certainly in the show in Paris, but here for sure, the contrast became harder. I mean, became sharper, became more direct, which is strange because we live in very uncertain times, and it maybe therefore this sort of like necessity for some kind of unseen clarity or something like that.
You mean the contrast tonally?
Tonal contrast, heightening colors, things like that.
Yeah, I could see that. I just sort of amped it up a bit.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, the painting itself is illegible. I got some interesting stats. You know, he only painted for around 8 years. That was it. I just took some groups to see the great Bob Thompson show, which is at 52 Walker downtown. Bob Thompson, who also painted for just 8 years, but Bob Ross made 30,000 paintings in that period, 30,000, and he would make 3 of each composition so that he could use them in the films. And someone analyzed it and concluded that 91% of them have at least one tree and almost none have any people. And you see here the sort of vegetation in his pictures. They refer to his work as entertainment memorabilia. Entertainment memorabilia. It's kind of interesting phrase, if not fine art.
No, but it's interesting because in a sense, of course, this is not high art, but on the other hand, it had a different sort of meaning, a different sort of purpose to it. And that's why I thought this was really ironic. I mean, seeing the fact that you have a link now with art and lifestyle. So yeah, of course. I mean, there is a market. So there is, and this whole branding situation, this whole situation, sort of like cooped up in this personality. They also made a film about it because his life was a bit more complicated than, of course, the other things show.
Then his demeanor would suggest 3 wives, many affairs, and then big contretemps about his estate. But I wonder,
and also the people who sort of like abused it in a sense.
Yeah.
So this all was the fascination where this thing came out.
I wonder if you are thinking about this also as part of, you know, another image that stands for a kind of Americanism, America. But unlike the covered bridges, which weren't disseminated around the globe, Bob Ross everywhere, countries all over the world. This sort of extraordinary fascination with this particular guy and his 381 episodes, which you can see free on YouTube as a kind of, I don't know, not an imperialism, but a sort of dissemination of something about America in these works.
Yeah, I mean, it became the product itself in a sense. So, which in a way is virtually abstract. It's kind of interesting. I mean, anyway, how the art market came about is largely a construction which was made after the Second World War, if you'd like. I mean, in the largest sense, it was a sort of covert operation, basically. Yeah.
And the other cool thing is, I guess, or interesting thing, is that you can't actually buy the paintings. So the paintings, in a way, don't exist. They're not for sale. You can't buy them. It's only the kind of very mannered depictions of him making them that exist.
Yeah, which makes it all the more interesting. So there is an area about it, and there is this purely sort of like mediatized imagery that then survives. Although I think there are images that are, so there are also fake Bob Rosses that were sort of
many fakes. I think the only ones that really sell are the ones from before he started doing the show, which is also kind of interesting. Let's move around this room a little bit because we could hang out with Bob all day and his happy trees. To the left of him, something of a different order. Buca, this painting from 2023. I think it's the most visually complex work in the show.
The what?
I feel it's the most visually complex work in the show.
Yeah, it's taken from my iPad. This is because I'm following the Ukraine war very thoroughly, and this was the moment when they were actually excavating these people. I mean, the people that were murdered in Buca, but it was actually positioned upon a framework of a map, and you can also see the little icon here that again refers to social media or things where they come from, which in a sense then makes it the fact how you sort of try to read the image much more complicated. Also, the whole situation, the whole scene is overlit by the two lamps that sort of shine onto the point where they are actually doing the excavation.
So is this
there's one figure that is sort of also like a sort of amorphous figure that sort of is passing by or is becoming or is going to pass by, things like that.
And is a kind of negative figure in a way. You painted around him in a sense. Is this just a deconstruct a little? This is something, maybe an image that you printed out and then put on top of a surface, or it's something?
No, it was already on top of that surface. I mean, it was the screen figure also, so you could see the map behind it.
Yeah. Well, the work that it reminded me of is this one.
That's a long stretch. Yeah. I mean,
that's the job of the art historian to dig.
It's one of my favorite works. I think this is probably the first political image. I mean, or one of the first political images in painting, in a sense.
Yeah.
Which this was actually painted to save his neck. I mean, because of course he had contact with French officers and the Enlightenment, and the king was reinstalled. He made those two paintings, the one of the uprisal, and then of course the repercussions, the execution. And it's a painting about atrocity. It's a painting about both our paintings are about that, but I think Goya is still better though.
Well, Goya, I think you two share a sort of fiery approach to the present. I think that's something that, as you say, presents itself in Romanticism. David had the same kind of outlook, and here's Goya sort of responding fervently to this.
David is a bit more difficult. David is probably, I mean, I think you made a comparison with David and Charles Ray somewhere.
That is true.
Which I found interesting.
Rail.
That's going from the apprehension for the idea of classicism. I mean, which is true, but then of course David was one of the most diabolical painters ever because he was the closest to power.
Absolutely.
The revolution, then Napoleon, and of course one of his major paintings. There are several copies of it. One of them is actually in the Louvre, but the real thing is in Brussels, which is the Death of Marat, which is pure propaganda. I mean, this is
absolutely
the closest you can get to power in a sense. And yeah, that is a fascination I do have, though, not to have power, but how power is constructed. But in terms of David, it becomes diabolical, it becomes dangerous in a sense.
Well, David was a fascist bootlicker for sure in his heart, and then following Napoleon and the empire. And it's interesting the way you're talking about Goya in this painting, because of course he tried to do it to save his skin, but in the end it was not accepted. Ferdinand rolled them up and put them in the basement. And this and it's other one didn't come out.
During his lifetime, these things were never shown.
Yeah.
And of course, it was interesting because, of course, I think Goya was probably the very first old master on the brink of modernity, in a sense. I mean, before Manet and all those people.
Yeah.
And yeah, of course, I mean, I think Manet got a big shock when he saw these things. And
yeah, he did.
Even Jeff Wall got a big shock when he saw Goya later.
Yeah.
And it's one of my preferred artists because he's uneven and therefore annoying. And so that makes him, I mean, of course, I like Velasquez because it's fabulous, but Goya is more uneven. So there is a different stroke of humanity in it, which I find very important.
Yeah. Do you think that there's anything about your project which relates to history painting? Would you consider it in a kind of, through that kind of lens?
Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. I mean, there's also about some kind of like political stance to it, which there is to a certain point. But I also don't think that you can load up a work of art with a political stand from the beginning, because then it would be propaganda.
Right, right.
But a work of art can have a political stance at a certain given moment, which was the case, for example, with the Monarchy Toko series in the Belgian pavilion, because that pavilion was built by a colonial architect.
Yeah.
And it also came together with a book that came out from Ludo de Witt about the fact that for once and for all, he actually diluted the whole story about that it was the CIA and so on, which was, of course, entangled in it, but it was mostly the Brussels establishment and on the side, the king that actually ordered the murder.
Mm-hmm. But history painting as something that responds to contemporary events, certainly can verge into propaganda. But what about like the way that Rauschenberg played with it and the biohistory in his combines? I mean, I see that as a kind of thread going through, and it feels like what you're doing is very different, but is also, something related to this kind of practice.
Yeah, but
very personal.
But in a sense, I mean, yeah, Rauschenberg, you could say, through the element of collage, came to this point of a sort of awareness of the times he was living in, which everybody does. I mean, you cannot get away from your own contemporary. It's kind of. So even in terms of the light, it's already an impossibility. I mean, sometimes you see that the light you produce is digitalized.
Right.
So there are these things that work in that sense. To say that that's history painting, it's difficult to see it in the sense that history paint was seen in the 19th century. Then I would say no. I mean, it's a deprivation of that. I mean, for example, you have the October group of Richter, which is a fabulous work also, which is unluckily now no longer in Germany, but in the MoMA where they never show it, which is sort of
not for a long time. It's true.
No, which is a really important landmark. I mean,
they show F111 more often than that series. Yeah. This is a longer conversation that I'd love to have, and something I've been thinking about for a long time. But let's show the last three works to get to of the exhibition here. Looking back now with our back to Bob Ross, looking straight through back to Gallery 1, and then these two works left and right, which flank the entrance.
Yeah, this is a phone. It's the only picture I made. I mean, this year actually, I did a show together with Slatko Kopliar, a Croatian artist, a friend, and we did a show in Lithuania and Vilnius. And this is a photograph I took in the KGB Museum in Vilnius.
I gave
have two phones with no numbers.
Put a little map here. Put a little map for the
With no numbers on it, a black one and a beige one, which was directly connected with the KGB.
And so it was a direct line to Moscow.
Yeah, right.
Which you see here on the map.
Interesting because I mean, Vilnius is quite close to the war zone in a sense.
Yeah.
And then the other one, and of course you have the soldier in the middle, so then it sort of adds up. You show two flags. I mean, one that was painted in 1995 and one from Luhansk, which is occupied territory by the Russians now.
This is a Russian Federation flag on the left, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other one is the Flemish flag.
Yeah, the Flemish flag. The Federation flag. So that's from a photo that you found online of the.
Yeah, it's actually, there's somebody speaking next to it, but I took that off. And I was amazed by all these speeches that were given in front of these flags, which looked like they were made out of a certain synthetic. Yeah. They didn't look like cloth. They're like synthetic, like nearly plastified material in a sense.
They look like ICBMs to me. They look like they look like a missile. And
they look like a sort of more different material than what a flag is actually made of. So
yeah.
So, the other one is actually made from a watercolor I made from the Flemish flag, which is a black line on a yellow backdrop, which I then crumbled and then put with a pin into the wall and made a Polaroid of. And that was out of a show called Heimat, which was was a sort of reaction against what happened in my hometown, where 1 out of 3 voted for a sort of xenophobe, extreme right-wing Flemish party. So, and I decided to go head on with the symbols.
So that's a polarization, a sort of pre-polarization image on the right. Yeah, I just saw it, and I was looking through the catalog raisonne, and it seemed to have some affinity. But I don't know if it's something that you're thinking about when you're doing the present one. on the left.
Yeah, of course, because this is also a flag. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is here it's about the idea of disappearing. There it's about really being really present as terms of material. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Very nice. And the phone, I think, is really compelling. It's in a glass case. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
And the painting, this is the one that sort of most engaged me in terms of its surface and the way that you're working with it. You mentioned Manet before, and the use of these dark tones against light tones and a kind of modulation. Can you talk a little bit about facture and surface and how you think about it in these pictures, which read very differently, obviously, you know, in reproduction and even from a distance than when you're in the gallery?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that I always was against creating a style because I thought that would kill it. But of course, after nearly more than 700 paintings, you create something like an aesthetic that falls in your neck.
Yeah.
But I look at it much more as handwriting in a sense, and your handwriting also changes the older you get. So it's about the immediacy and the intensity. It's all about precision and timing. And these are things that are not completely explainable in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so every stroke has to be in its way decisive or necessary, not unnecessary. That's the one important thing. So in that sense, there is some kind of minimalism in the work, if you like. And because otherwise it becomes less credible for me. On the other hand, everything has to be painted, even when it has to look like it's unsharp. The unsharpness is painted. It's not wiped away. It's
right.
Materialized through the paint.
Right.
So these are all very important things. And also the idea that I was talking about, the idea of the distance. I mean, the distance between a work and the viewer is really important, but the distance between me and my work is also important. So the moment you actually see the image from afar, and I also work with the mirror, as a lot of artists probably do, to turn the image upside down and also to double up the distance in a sense, and to sort of disengage yourself a little bit from it, it's in between this idea of distance and image that a great deal of the meaning is actually propelled. Once you come closer to the image, it sort of disintegrates. And I find that quite a fascinating situation.
So you don't do a lot of walking back and forth when you're painting these pictures?
Well, when I'm painting, I'm close to the painting. So of course I walk back to see what I've done. But the decisive moment is always the distance. I mean, from how far you can actually see the image.
Yeah, fantastic. Really interesting. I worked on 19th century painter John Everett Millais, career athlete painter, and he talked about when he did a portrait, sometimes he would walk, he reckoned 3 miles a day, back and forth from the canvas, move back, look at the sitter who was a little more distance, and that he would, it was almost like an athletic activity, working with the canvas. But to think of you close up to these big pictures and then just finishing it and moving back is
yeah, but there's also the moment that you do something to a painting that you don't only see but also feel.
Yeah.
This is
This
is the inexplainability of, although everything is really laid out and everything is sort of like rationalized, because I actually work from, let's say, the lightest zones to the darkest. So the darkest contrast is what I do actually in the end.
Yeah.
So that means in the beginning, I'm working kind of blindfolded. I mean, just, although I know what I'm doing, but then just when the first contrast comes in, that the image starts to fall together.
Yeah.
And that's when actually the pleasure begins. That's where you start to reinstate the image and try to make it into something. But then there still are things that you don't expect. I mean, and these are actually the more beautiful elements in it.
Yeah, I think they're well on display in these galleries. And also, as someone who's a curator, I very much appreciate the way that you carefully laid out the show. Just a few things. I always take these sort of images, you know, the void here in the phone, the dial-less phone. Someone wrote this in the chat, where it just goes directly to Moscow. It's like the bat phone in Batman. And then the void here in the covered bridge. And then, of course, the connection with the darkness, the nocturnal scene here on the right. And then the way that at the angle, you can see the phone, the Russian flag, and then the Ukrainian soldier in the distance. Fantastic. And then this vista, which we already looked at, with, again, here, the void is the person here, and the circle is the angelic kind of halo and the bellhop.
Yeah,
really
all those elements come together. But that's what I say. But after the especially the Palazzo Grata show, which was a very personal show where I made a very personal choice, I thought it was important to do gallery shows like little museum shows in a sense.
Yeah.
So that sort of like make them come together out of different elements and different spheres, but bring it together very tightly in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell my students that do not miss these gallery shows, because you'll never see these works together again until 40 years from now when someone does it.
No, and also I think gallery show is not just a shop, it's also where you first show your new work, which is kind of an initial point. And what's of course also important is just to know that I also stopped painting from 1980 to 85 because I thought of it as being too existential and too tormented, and I was too close to the image in a sense. And then I filmed for about 5 years, which altered the entire vision later when I came back to painting, because it gave me, as I told you, the necessary distance to create what I wanted to create.
Yeah. So the final room, now we got into it, is this one, Polarization, based on a data visualization by Mauro Martino, and the work, which is in 4 parts and was first shown in Paris.
Yeah. So this was this came right after the numbers. I mean, at the show of COVID. I mean, this idea of polarization is, I wanted to make something about us and them, so we're not going to paint portrait of Trump, and it's not interesting. So I was scrolling the web, and I just stumbled upon this research that was done by Yale University up until 2015, for which this Mauro Martino made these graphs, which are normally horizontal. I turned them vertical, so they become much more of an entity. And I was kind of amazed by the imagery, in the sense that it's, of course, it's an image of counting, it's an image of sort of trying to map something, but at the same time, it has this sort of chaotic disperseness of it that makes it very uncanny to a point. And instead of dreaming this up myself, I thought it was important to stick to the reality of the image. So I contacted Mauro Martino if I was enabled to use these and turn them into paintings, which he agreed.
Subject matter is what, Luc? The dots represent.
The subject matter is actually, you see the House of Representatives and you see how people voted. So the blue ones are the Democrats, the red ones are, of course, the Republicans. And I took 4 stages. I mean, at the beginning is with Harry Truman right after the war, where you can see that the gray zone is kind of elaborate, so there's less polarization. 1967 is probably Johnson, still a sort of okay. 1989 is Papa Bush, and then it goes a little bit worse. And then with Obama, it's just fun. So that was kind of interesting to have these paintings. Also, they luckily are now in a museum collection in the States, which I wanted them to be, and so they're on their spot. I mean, and I think these are quite important because they were quite interesting for me to make. Also, actually, the smoothest surface is made with my hands. Also, so the red and the blue is sort of wiped out by hand instead of a brush.
It's interesting. We always talk about the legislative body. We call it the body. I played with that in my review of the David and the Charles Ray shows, but these do have a kind of organic biological quality. These, especially since you changed the format, right, from landscape to portrait, and they do feel like they have a bodily quality.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and of course, when first shown in Paris, they were more reminiscent of the idea of a virus or something like a contaminant, things like that. But in fact, they are very rational sort of constructions, and in a sense, they're also abstract. So that was what's quite fascinated me, and that's, I think, is what's important about this work.
Yeah, they're explosive in their form too. The way that the elements move, they have, like force lines in a cartoon, or trails of a comet. I think that's most visible in the last one. So you're saying the dots you did with your fingers? No,
the dots not. I mean the surface between it, because first I make the surface. The dots are really the far latest stage. I mean, one that sort of like, sort of finalize the imagery.
And here's the last work with this sort of, we're shooting off in all different directions.
Yeah, there's this idea of velocity, of speed, of movement, and things like that.
running from Marjorie Taylor Greene or something in these images. So, I mean, polarization, does that feel like a real theme in the show? I mean, the barn is one thing, a self-contained entity, a place that...
But the whole show is sort of culminates a little bit in this last space as a sort of statement. Therefore, the bench is kind of a joke, but it's there as a statement too.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's important that in that sense, the three shows sort of come together, like, and that's why the idea of making a publication or a trilogy out of it came about.
Yeah.
So because it's important for I mean, the times we are living are quite confusing in a sense. I mean, not to say that they are rather desperate. And in that sense, it was important to have this amount of color also, like in, for example, the Eternity painting, which is a beautiful painting, which people probably like because it's all red and all that.
The ball, the big ball.
But of course, there is this element of understatement that always plays out in the work.
Yeah.
Is to a certain point also maybe not cynical, but to a certain point sardonic. So
yeah,
and there was a premonition. There was this premonition that something would happen after this COVID affair, which was a global thing and a global disaster, and then it would turn into something even more difficult, like what we are actually experiencing right now. And this is actually also a sort of a thing that led up to that situation in a way.
Right. Yeah, I feel like they're fraught with anxiety, and they remind me, especially being here in New York, of New York school painting, especially Adolf Gottlieb, the great bursts, and these kinds of works which were made in the essentially under the umbrella of nuclear anxiety, and these seem to have a similar kind of feeling when I look at them, although the color sort of gives them a kind of ebullience.
Yeah, that is the contradiction in it.
Yeah, that's it. I think, I don't know if you want to talk about these. The studios.
Yeah, well, these were also in the show, but we couldn't hang them actually. The one thing was more an ironic thing. The image you see here with the little, it's an inflatable duck that you could sort of like an inflatable animal that you could put on a swimming pool.
Right.
Which is an image of which I made a whole sort of animation film about it too. And this is one of the drawings of that animation when it was not yet finished, which is on the surface of the pool where it was a pool that friends of mine actually hired when I had my birthday during COVID. And at the end of the night, the owner of the bed and breakfast started to put laser lights on it. And the other one is
like at a club.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
The other one is kind of blood. This is sort of like a blood plate, which is used in research. And the blood is sort of shifting away from the surface. And that I wanted to have in the show because I wanted to have it next to the flag and the soldier, which would have resonated in downright fascism in a sense. But this we couldn't show in the show. There was not enough space for it.
If I can be goofy for a second, all New Yorkers will recognize this as a black and white cookie. I'm sorry. It's a big New York tradition, black and white cookie. By the way, Luc had a birthday last week, so happy birthday to you. To be birthday. I thought we'd show this, since I just showed an image of the studio, and so people get a little bit of a window into the practice with, as Luc has been talking about, the canvases, the linen on the wall. And it was remarkable to me how big the overall canvases are, and then the size of the image. And then you know, when you stretch them, there's nothing on the sides. It's just the canvas on the sides, but working on this sort of scale. And then everyone can see the color marks on the side, which is a little bit of what you were talking about, and the way the canvases are laid out like a palette here on the table. Thank you for sharing this with us. I think it's a great window into the process. I am going to move aside, but I have one more image to show you.
Oh, yeah.
Because
one
of the greatest paintings on the planet. And I know that you used it in an exhibition, which I did not see, tragically, in pairing it with one of your works. And most Americans are not familiar with Knopf. I went to Paris to see the show. You see at the bottom left in 2000, 19. And you know, I'm as someone who's trained in 19th century art history, I'm fascinated by your interest in these kinds of works. And I wanted to ask you, besides Knopf, you know, what other artists interest you, especially like American artists? Have you always loved Hopper?
I was very fascinated by Hopper, yeah, because I saw that when I was 19 or something in a show in London about the Hayward Gallery, I think, about American art. Didn't know what it was.
Huh.
And the same day I found a book about it in Foil, I suppose. No, Hopper was fascinating to me because and I also made a reaction to it, to that fascination. I made a whole series about toys, you know, the little priceless figurines you use in modeling and so on. Because for me, actually, Hopper was actually, besides being art, it was also a toy, in a sense. It's a very strange thing.
You mean the way that he dealt with figures?
Yeah, of course, the thing that he put it in scene, and there is this sort of like animosity. There is this, there's also a huge distance, in this, which I kind of like. And so there is this element of the object that plays out and how this is made. So no, Hopper is one of, and of course he becomes iconic for, you know, if you think about the States in a very weird way. I mean, it becomes iconic. It has also very reminiscences to the films made during or after. So there is always this element that plays out with that work.
Did you get to see the Hopper in New York show at the Whitney that we just had?
No, I didn't. No.
We got to send you that book. It will knock your socks off. It's amazing. The other artist I wrote down was Sickert.
Yeah, Sickert, because Sickert was, as I said, also if you would compare John Singer Sargent and Sickert, they worked at the same time.
Yeah.
Which one would you choose? I would actually choose Sickert because he is much more poignant in some way or another.
Yeah.
I mean, and gruesome to a point also. But on the other hand, this painterly practice is also something that really interested me.
Yeah.
He was also a person that was criticized, highly criticized, for using existing imagery to paint from. I mean, and one of the first one that initiated that process into the painting process.
Yeah, I mean, he's also someone who's not that well known in the US. We have the germs of an interesting show here, possibly, but I will leave it at that. Luc, thank you so much for the conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Chloe to field some questions from the audience. But I appreciate your generosity in giving us your time and to speak about each and every work in the show. It's fantastic. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much, Luc.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that dialogue. We do have some really great questions from the audience. The first question is going to be from Matthew Biro. Matthew, I'll give you the chance to unmute now to ask.
Thank you so much both for that really illuminating conversation. So one of the longstanding subjects of your work is the relationship between painting and the mass media. Could you talk a little bit more about the iPhone? How do you, for example, use it in the making of your work? And beyond that, do you see the iPhone as something in some ways symbolic? I mean, you give us clues in your paintings that we're seeing what we are seeing through our phones. So the phone is becoming a visual frame or a mode of seeing. Why has this become important to you?
Yeah, well, first of all, when I started to use something else, as just drawing in watercolors and maquettes, which to a certain point I still do to create something else. But it was actually a Polaroid that I used first in 1995. Like when you saw the flag, I thought about it, which was interesting because it was very bad quality. So, and you could not really control it. So, and it actually was not a photograph, it's an emulsion. So it sort of develops itself like I paint it starts to grow and grow and grow until the image sort of like materializes in front of you, which I found fascinating. And also an element of chance that was in there. So then, of course, years later, there was the iPhone that came on the market. And I'm not really particularly a person who was into gadget, but the idea of the touch screen, so fascinating to me that I had to have it. You can actually enlarge things on the phone. You can use, this is also the point where unlike analog photography, which created a distance, the hand sort of comes back into the game. I mean, Hockney talked about that when he made these iPad paintings, actually, which are also kind of fascinating in a sense. So that was a little bit that. And also the fact that it's, of course, very portable. You can use it and you can actually make an image, forget about it, come back to it. You can also stack it away. So there is this whole element of possibilities. And then you can even try to enlarge it and use it nearly as a sketch in real time of making this imagery and then combining them with others and so on and so on. So it's become really a tool in order to sort of like keep a sort of awareness. Whereas in older days, of course, you would have to make a drawing, you would have to or remember it and things like that. So because I never was a photographer in a sense, so that was not really an option. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yes, I mean, I think that's fascinating, this comparison between the, the analog photograph and the kind of the digital screen. Could you maybe put that in relation to how you understand time and history in the sense?
No, I can give you a real example because he showed you the image of the Knopf image, for example. I once won a prize, I don't know when it was, like 2006 or something like the Max Beckmann's Stiftungsprofessor Prize, and that was from the Stedel, the museum in Frankfurt. And of course, I had to make a show, I had to do talks and work with the students of the academy, but I also had to put one of my works in one of the spaces of the museum. So I chose the 19th century and where this painting was, which was one of my preferred paintings, and also Max Liebermann and all that. And I showed a painting of a diptych. One was at that point in Shanghai, and the other one was still in Europe, and that one was shown, which is a guy which was shoveling in my garden before a tree, which was actually a friend of mine, another painter, which was actually part of a diptych. And so in terms of imagery, this could have easily fit into this sort of framework of what the imagery was there, but the light didn't. The light was digital. So that was a shock. So that's how it really shows you that even if you're not even aware of the contemporaneity of things like those things, which are in things that are purely circumstantial, will creep into the work.
Wow, amazing question, Matthew, and thank you for those responses, Luc. The next question I'm going to ask on behalf of Karen in the audience. Karen is wondering what happens to the meaning of the paintings, say 100 years from now, when the historical context and references have changed and maybe even disappeared.
But I don't know. I mean, there is, of course, still the visual. I mean, maybe the paintings will have won back some kind of innocence. I don't know. So then people will watch it with different eyes. That is very, very, very difficult to predict because assessing the point, that would also be assessing the point that we go into a certain type of oblivion. So if we go into that point, then we have to reinvent Impressionism and all the other things. So in a sense, that's a very difficult assessment to make and probably not one that I can make.
Thank you. And thanks for that question, Karen. Tom McGlynn at the Rail is wondering if you feel there is a specific sense of Belgian humor that you identify with. He's thinking of the mischievous type of absurdist humor exhibited in Bruegel's great painting, Flemish Proverbs, but he's wondering if you have a humor.
Well, if there's something that is really Belgian, I mean, because you also have, of course, to understand that Belgium is a fairly young country. It was only founded in 1830, so it's younger than the United States. After the Napoleonic Wars. Of course, the region was always quite important, but always under different rulers, this was always overrun. So we didn't have the time to be romantic like the Germans or rational like the French. So there was this large element of opportunism in terms of survival. So, and this also had an impact on the visual. And the visual, therefore, is always dealing with reality as the real. So without, let's say, anthroposophic societies or the esoterical part of it, but the real element of it. And this can go to a certain sardonic point, to a point that might be the sense of humor, but that sense of humor is kind of real also in a sense. So the idea of realism is really important. And this goes from Van Eyck to, you can take Bruegel in there, you can take I mean, even a person like Magritte, which is perceived as a surrealist, but one of his major paintings, Les Trahisons des Images, shows a pipe, which then says this is not a pipe. Of course not, because it's the image of a pipe. So that is a sort of assessment that's been running as a red line through that sort of heritage, if you like, or legacy.
Thank you, Luc. And thanks, Tom, for that question. I'll ask a question next. Luc, I'm curious how you think about grief relative to your paintings, because when I think about how you play with the sensorial expressions present in the trace of an image and sort of that nonsensical relationship to time that happens over an image's impact instead of maybe the image itself in time and space at the time it's being used. And I'm curious if you think about grief or grappling in relationship to your paintings.
Would you mean grief?
Mm-hmm. Grief, like
trauma? Or
yeah, like memory, relative to memory.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course. The thing is, of course, painting is a belated medium, so it works through time, over time, with time. And for me, it was always important not to be this meaning should be multi-layered, which is that it has to remain. It should also be not really sort of moralizing in a sense, but it should make through distance a sort of assessment, which is a different one than in real time to a point, because you, of course, physically remake the image. And for me, it's really important to know what I'm painting, because then I also know how I'm going to paint it. And so since I already work from represented imagery, I really need this signifier. I mean, it's important. That doesn't mean that I want to push that through the throat of the spectator. The spectator can see whatever they want to see in it. But for me, it's really important that the element is relevant. If that's in grief or trauma or whatever, that is something else. I mean, but it has to have a relevance.
Thank you. Ray B asked a great question in the chat. And Ray, I'm going to give you a chance to unmute if you'd like to. Otherwise, I can ask it on your behalf.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead and ask.
Okay. Hi, Luc. I wanted to ask you this in person at the show, but I got kind of nervous. That was at your opening. I watched your interviews on YouTube, and one time you said that art cannot come from art. I was wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So I mean, that doesn't mean that, like you saw Goya and other reminiscent, that I'm not cannot be inspired by other artists. I mean, I can admire them, but I cannot really build on that. So I think it's really important that the art that you sort of construct, of course, is informed by all these other things. For sure it is. But that it's sort of like, as a directive, tries to choose something that is relevant within your own contemporarity. I think that's quite an important point for me. So that's what I mean with not being derived directly from art. I mean, because so it never came to my mind in terms of like, should I sort of position myself towards, let's say, what the Neue Wilde did, or what postmodernism did, or what minimalism did? Being aware of that and being able to admire things like Ryman or Ad Reinhardt or all those things, or Rothko, so on, that is true, but I cannot really work from there. So I don't see that as a lineage.
Thank you for that question, Ray, and thank you for that response, Luc. The last question today is going to be from the Rail's publisher and artistic director, Phong Bui. Phong, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Luc. Congratulations on an amazing show. And I have so many questions, but I'm going to try to see whether I can just make it into only two. Following what Matthew's question, actually, I remember running to John Updike, I think right after his review of Warhol retrospective at MoMA, that was in '89, and the review was called Fast Art for Busy Manhattanites. And it was a beautiful review, but I asked him, have you ever seen Warhol's film? He said no, which is the opposite. It's super slow, some of them even 4 hours plus, you can imagine. And in the question were the fact that you've been following the Ukraine war as closely as I am. You remember when Zelensky, with his first subverting selfie video, where he filmed himself in the short segment with his official on the street, and he say, "We will defend our independence." That was in, I don't know, late February 2022. That's how it will go. So my question is, yes, it's super true about your early 5 years studying film, watching film have affected the way you think about painting in every other, manner of approach and whatnot, pictorially speaking. So it make me think a little bit further in the early 60s, look, when capitalist realism in Düsseldorf, must have been 63, 64, I can't remember exactly the date, but during the Cold War, when this group of artists as Richter, Buca, Kutchner, and Konrad Look was trying to challenge, in a way, the dominant influence of American pop in Western world. And I wonder, I mean, you must have been 5 or 6 years old when that happened, but you must have come to be aware of that effort made, which is super important to all of those artists I mentioned. And I wonder how you rethink of the way that pop culture, I don't mean just Warhol, but also from perspective after capitalist realism.
But let's talk about Warhol first, because it took a long time for me to understand Warhol, up until a point that I saw a retrospective in Beaubourg and Centre Pompidou and came out and understood that black was really important for Warhol. Now, black is also the color that you print with. So that's the authority of print. That made him a very analytical artist to me, in a sense. Also, the fact that Warhol comes from Eastern Europe. And I did a show which was called The Reality of the Lowest Rank, which was a sort of quote from, what's his name, from Tadeusz Kantor. And I included, of course, Stravinsky, Cobra, Wroblewski, Alina Sapolsky, and a new group of young artists from Eastern Europe, but also Warhol, because, I mean, there's a reminiscence to look at pop art from a different perspective, in a sense. So that's how I look at it in terms from the European element. And the people you mentioned, Konrad Look, Richter, of course, they were extremely important because they had to position themselves in this sort of in this sort of art world, which was also sort of emulating from the States and had a huge impact in a sense. Not in the least the market that was created.
Yeah.
So I think that it's of course always important to not be dictating something. It's much more important to keep a certain openness, and therefore the idea of Warhol, of how I got to understand it and how long it took to understand it, I think is quite important. I think. I mean, so besides the idea of what pop art is or something like that, I think that is a bigger framework. The fact that he was Eastern Europe, that he was very religious, all those things sort of like come together in a completely different idea than just looking at the image face value. And what actually I do find of, I mean, of course, people like V.S. Selmans and Richter, who use the idea of photography as the banal, in a sense, and of course, there is also the Hannah Arendt's and the banality of evil, if you'd like. But in my case, I'm actually much more the product of a television generation. And in that sense, transmitted imagery is important, movement imagery is important, and the idea to freeze that particular image into something that is muted and does not remind you of sound nor music, let alone the sound of music. And that is a different option, in a sense, that that is a different take upon those things. So,
it's so interesting because as I was looking at while you were talking with Jason, the Born painting, and I was actually in the gallery the other week with Dan Colan, the painter, and we were talking about how it reminded us so much of Warhol, paint by numbers, you know?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Exactly, do-it-yourself kind of thing. It makes perfect sense, look. From do-it-yourself paint by number into the joy of painting. I mean, that's what we were thinking about Warhol and Bob Ross all at once in one, conversation. But what I was thinking also, since you mentioned Bob Ryman in 2007, I think, must have been in February, right after my interview with Bob Ryman, there was an amazing retrospective by Morandi at the Met. It was Monday, I was there, and I call him from Lieberman's office, and I say, the museum's closed. Why don't you hop on the cab, come up and see the show? No one's here. I'd be happy to look at the Morandis. Anybody in New York City who would appreciate Morandi would be you. And he said to me, I've seen enough of them. And I say, you mean when you were a guard, MoMA, there's only 3 of them at MoMA collection. They hardly ever hang them. He said, that's right, but it's enough. And I say, why? And he said, because they make me anxious. It's so interesting that he say that. He could say that in a way, I guess you can say that. So my last question is the mediation between speed and slowness, Luc. I think that's one thing that always I felt deeply when I look at Cézanne and I look at how he dealt with it. In the same way, the 2 most astute reader, in a way, of Cézanne would be one, on the left side would be Giacometti, who took the anxious side of Cézanne, and on the other side, on the right, is Morandi, who took the meditative side, serene side of Cézanne. So there's something about Morandi, about Cézanne, about speed and slowness, and I think it's very complexly deployed in your work. Would that something that you agree or disagree?
Well, I talked about precision and timing, so that sort of coops it up. And I think that's not only so for Cézanne or Giacometti or Morandi, or that I think it's mostly deals, it's very important if you have this painting practice in a sense. So because there is this sort of intensity that has to be steered in a way that it does not only make sense, but that it also works. So in that sense, I mean, and looking at Morandi, for example, Morandi is something I can really understand. I mean, it's a way of painting that is very painterly. And at the same time, it makes you wonder, I mean, in terms of what it actually sort of means. And Cézanne for me is something that is very analytical, and on the other hand is also kind of very vulnerable in its presence and the way his brushstrokes shorten, for example, and have this sort of reminiscence to a luminosity that has to do with glass.
Yeah.
And Giacometti to me comes across as somebody who sort of narrows down the space into a particular point from which he actually creates the image. So these are three different practices. I mean, I don't know if they one borrowed from the other, but I think that this painting is a specific time. It's not real time; it's painted time. So that specific time zone that is has a mind of its own, in a sense. Yeah.
Well, that's beautifully answered. Thank you. One tiny little haiku question. What kind of medium you use? Because Dan and I was looking at it, and we wonder whether you might have, do you use safflower oil or poppy oil, stand oil, or linseed oil, or a little bit of wax? How do you manage to make that brush stroke stand the way it stands? And lastly, I think this body of work, what compellingly for me so much is that the unpainted white linen area, it speaks so loudly as present as the painted area. So what's the medium you use?
First of all, I don't use oil because the the quality of the oil paint I use is Rembrandt, which is like not the best. It's not like Winsor, but there's a lot of oil already in the paint. So I just use turpentine to sort of yeah, to lean it up and to make it more fluid. And the white of the canvas is actually never there, because the very first thing I do before I start to paint is to paint a color of white, which is a tonal zone. If you look carefully to, like, say, the backdrop of the graphs, you will see that they are going into a greenish white. So there is always a tonality. And tonality is important because tonality is a different formulation of depth in real time on that surface. So,
okay, well, that's terrific. Thank you, Luc, and congratulations.
thank you.
I quit smoking, but I'm gonna lit one in your honor.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Back to you, Chloe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions, everyone. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Lewis Freedman, who is going to read to conclude today's event. Lewis Freedman is the name of a poet and person. Books published under this name include Residual Synonyms for the Name of God and I Want Something Other Than Time, both from Ugly Duckling Press. A special handwritten edition of I Want Something Other Than Time will be released this summer. Please join me in welcoming Lewis.
Hello. Thank you so much, Luc and Jason, for that compelling conversation. It made me change the poem I would like to read. And so I'll try reading this poem. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you to everyone at the Rail. So this poem is called Eternal Balsamic Contract. It's relatively recent to me. And it takes about 5 or so minutes to read. Forever, a concept gets lost serving speech. And though the register of poetry with its high sighs might throw a giant eternity pressed into the sky towards a day that will save it, at each tremor, a palm reaches in and empties the till, steadies the shake. Look, it says, imagining the composition before it was wrote. Your strength is in your kindness and understanding, which exceeds what we sell. Okay, I say, farting on a rock and sealing the sound with song. Misguided too, as though poetry could renew the witness into wonder and avert the exploitation of work. I don't know, me being an infinitesimal fragment of fiction within the whole. I just want to praise the meal we just ate, to look back through the door we just walked through and let you know your shoes are really great. I see the same enemy expand forever, map the uninhabited to leave it taken while we keep signing what's left, singing in a blue chorus of bruised lips, cooing bright blue rounds. Is every single spot on earth a recursive ring we're caught in, a recursive ring we don't remember, never having been anywhere but this recursive ring? The machine picks up. A message is left. Image of a comet passing through the night sky, its reflection in a river running through woods. It looks so drawn and cartoony. And same enemy brands it our eternal logo, writes it on the crumbling page, works the circle recursively to arrive there before us, percussively tunes it to move like power. And it sinks me to show this negation repeat in my voice from as rising form. Apparition of our dissolving face, vaporized only to wriggle like sample smoke into ears now gone. I mean, there's this noise right before we feel the earthquake, a crack like some secret tectonic intelligence below the mesa is focusing a shriek and cries out, "You pieces of shit." A tiny headache for weeks. Air leaks out our lips, making low preparatory sounds for speech, but the utterance won't collect. Little fiery coals swish around our mouths and pool in a gargle. Bleak testament this. And fodder for our future jokes. tossing bleak into breeze to watch it swing upwards. Its traces are wings embroidered with our logo, a comet across the sky reflected in a river, which signs our eternal spirit, our enduring strength, while our sleep goes rancid around us and our mind is mostly to disappear and live gone through, forgetting to drink water, so lost in our games. But if the thunder and lightning and everything up on high, which gives the storm its voice, gets blown out down here in commercials, then why do I repeat it as the crisis of our remove? As though if even half of eternity could be delivered in pizza instead of sky, it would be warm on arrival, a spell of half smiles writ like distant lightning on my face. Is it that when only the forces we oppose can save us, we feel grateful to them while hating the great which covers our hate, moving in an onwards which precedes the day we'll confront this, singing eternity be the clock which defers this? I went out to the street and laughed because look at us, morphed and humped by our same enemy deferrals, empties of a self-extraction whose ceaseless hand gestures dig a grave we've sat down in, guarding its borders as though our value is on the line. If we could just admit how we aren't humans, but our erratic shaking idea of human, then might no bad thing befall us? Might we grow up perfect as that ancient cedar tree across the street with its rock-hard abs? I mean, imagine a gigantic snow globe as somehow a tautology. This is how forever sits in me, and my middle goes numb, and I must squint to stay inside. It's because we theorized a candle which, burning eternally, can only be reached by thought, and so bends under our weight until it goes out while the image of its glow remains. And I practice saying to my mirror, let goodness good the good, staying simple because it's simple, and let clarity clear the clearing to accept a path. And I winnow this by repetition to a protective syrup which travels with me, having sealed my passage in a drop. And are not our protections also our lonelinesses? And at Bernie's rock shop on Johnson, I asked, what's the cheapest good crystal you got? I'm hoping this maze might be how in a world so vast of distributed difference, our hands have trained the heat and words to weave a guessing net around our endless strangeness, the mutual muddle of carouselhood which swings this all around us. This is why we chase ourselves until we see we won't return, not until we serve our hidden prison. Like same enemy gave me more sleep than I could sleep, and through the dust of a half dream drifted our logo, comet in the sky mirrored in a river. For we are children, a voiceover says, of the children of the children of the children, of a sense of accreting endlessness and a scoring system posed as self-access. And this collision bears a being non-materialized, not to us at all. If we'd lived like rocks for real, there'd be room for a higher tongue, a prophetic rock to prepare us for forever's fall, the loss of forever's immunity. But we've lived like jackets buttoned up over a glowing report of our birth, and held down birth pang interiors fall through a voice, unmapping a dispersed and exploded time. And I'm grateful to you for not holding this against me, and also for signing the poem at its end, see below. If we were to stack our praises in a tower and make ourselves soak and wash them, we'd find an endless need rinsed clean, sparkling unfit our endless far strangeness. Your signature here. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lewis. That was such an amazing end to today's event. Thank you for reading today. And thank you, of course, as well to Luc and to Jason for today's extremely generous dialogue. Thank you to Aaron and Julia and the team from David Zwirner for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also, of course, like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor our NSE program and make daily conversations like this one possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our free monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're in New York and free tomorrow, join the rail at the Clemente for a celebration of River Rail Puerto Rico. And there'll be a link in the chat shortly. And if you're free on Monday at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with David Byrne and Paul D. Miller on the occasion of Here Lies Love at Broadway Theater in New York. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by our very own Ty Cooper at the Rail. And you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so, so much for joining us today, and happy Friday, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luke, Jason.
I loved it.
Kudos for your reading.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Luke.
Jason, good seeing
Appreciate it.
Thank you for the beautiful reading.